What's going on?
What's up, Captain?
I might ask you to lock that door.
Yep. The main door?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And we are good. All right. Feel free to just grab up a chair. So, welcome everybody to our first new edition for the new look of our Paul Robeson House Museum Parlor Talks. If you're watching this, you've probably been following us and seeing us evolve how we do events at the Robertson House and adapting our programming in the midst of the pandemic. So coming up with new strategies to invite people and have great conversations. Feel free to, use the chat within the Zoom to lift up, let us know who you are, where you're coming in from. And we'll also have time for questions today. So please continue to leave comments. I just want to say thank you. And we have some special guests here in the audience as well. And if you have any questions or like to add something to the conversation, please don't hesitate. We're just going to try to make this as rich as dialogue as possible. I'm Christopher Rogers, the program director here at the Paul Robeson House Museum. I'm so grateful to have you all with us today. And I was so excited to be able to pull this program together. Not too long ago, we got a tour scheduled, a tour invite here at the Paul Robeson House Museum. Oh, let me take my mask off. That's exactly what they were saying. Let's go ahead and take it off before you get started. We got a tour invite here at the Paul Robeson House Museum from a very special guest who was in town. And it was a birthday present, right?
Right. It was a birthday present.
It was a birthday present. We got to share about the influence of Paul Robeson and really like what led him into a life of organizing. Both here in the U.S. and across the world. And as the SNCC 60th anniversary conference is coming together, it is October 14th through the 16th. Will be taking place online. You can look up more details at SNCC60thanniversary.org. This was going to be a great way to kind of bring in that Philly connection, but also let folks know about the power and the legacy of SNCC. And then like bringing the SNCC legacy into continuing worldwide organizing. So excited to have our guest here today. And without further ado, I want to introduce you all to Michael Simmons.
Thank you very much. And
yes.
I'm flattered and happy to be here, happy to be asked, and look forward to a stimulating discussion. Yes.
Yes. So thank you again for making time this weekend. We have a number of questions that we came up with, but then also we want to hear from you all out there in terms of your questions and what you like to offer into the conversation. So please continue to lift those things up into the chat. And luckily we have a volunteer here who can help read those for us as they come in. So thank you for that. And kind of to get us started this afternoon, we are in the Paul Robeson House Museum. And just to kind of just ground us and, bring Uncle Paul with us into the room. When was the first time, where did you learn about Paul Robeson and what does, Paul Robeson mean to you?
I can't pinpoint when I first heard the name, probably from reading Jet magazine at the time. And I would tend to think that anything political about Paul Robeson, I didn't grasp at the time. I may have seen him as a musician during those days, and I'm talking about when I was in my early 10, 11, 12 kind of thing. And but I really didn't grasp his political significance until I became a teenager, and I happened to run into a African American communist by the name of Bill Crawford, who owned a bookstore in West Philadelphia. I think it was called the New World Bookstore or something like that. And I just happened to wander up because I was always looking for books on African American history. And back in those days, in the early 60s, it was very difficult to find anything. And Bill had all his books. And he started talking to me about Paul Robeson. And then I from that point on, I guess 1962, somewhere around there, I just have been enthralled by the magnitude of the man, and still am. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
In fact, I should say, excuse me.
Oh yeah.
Paul Robeson passed away here.
Yes.
Where we are, and Bill had tried to arrange for me to meet Mr. Robertson, and but his health prevented it, or I would have been. I mean, that stays on my mind to this very day.
Yes,
that I could have actually had a brief conversation.
Oh, that's great, and it reminds me of what we do at the house. There's so many different connections and neighborhood connections to Paul, and I was just lifting up upstairs the new edition of We Charge Genocide, which was just released by International Publishers. The prologue is written by Jarvis Tyner.
Really?
Jarvis Tyner, who's McCoy Tyner's brother, grew up here, in West Philadelphia, rises to the top and runs for president a couple times, part of the Communist Party ticket. So and he would talk about being connected to Paul Robeson on that's his house.
Yeah.
So thank you, and we want to invite that spirit, that legacy into the room as we get started. And kind of, going back to those, Philly days, tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I grew up in North Philadelphia, and my parents both were from the South. My mother from South Carolina, Rock Hill, and my mother, by the way, just parenthetically, would have been 100 today had she not passed. And my father was from a place called Ava, Georgia, and they were part of the migration of the period. Significantly, my mother, because of the poverty of her family, had to leave home at 12 years old and work. And by leave home, I mean leave the state of South Carolina. And this was about 1933. So I always think about what that must have been like for a young African American woman in that period of time. That my father had been married before, and I had three older brothers, and two of whom have passed, and one of when Malcolm X first came to Philadelphia, the meetings that they used to have was a block and a half away from my house, and my two brothers were my two older brothers. Were very early members of the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm X was a part of my growing up period. Yes. Not that I was aware of the political implications, so I don't want to exaggerate that.
Right.
But I used to hear these debates going on.
Yes. Between
the adults, my uncles and neighbors and all that. And so that period of my life I treasure. I went to a integrated elementary school that was educationally integrated, but in terms of housing, very segregated. So that didn't play with my white schoolmates after school. But back in those days, our community was a very close-knit community in the sense that the positive aspects of racial segregation, if you will, was that our community was very mixed. So that, there were poor folks like us, but there were also doctor, a lawyer, a city councilman lived right around the corner from us. So that I had a full range of social experiences in the neighborhood when I was growing up. And probably the most, my parents used to talk about the racial segregation in the South, but they never talked about it in a vitriolic way. It was almost humorous, looking at the ignorance of the racism. So that, and then I used to go south during the summer, like many African Americans of my generation who had family in the South. So that, and I didn't realize at the time, but the black community was so insular. So I really didn't see many white people when I was in the South. So I never really thought about the implications of racism until Emmett Till, and which happened in 1955, and when he was assassinated, as far as I'm concerned. That really was my first awakening of the implications of racism. I mean, racism up to that point was whether Jackie Robinson could play baseball or something, but it was not that virulent, vitriolic that I began to that had affected me. And then 2 years later, there was the school integration fight in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Yeah.
So that those two things really stayed on my mind. And while I didn't have a language for what I was going to do when I got older, I knew that it was going to be related to those issues.
Yeah.
Even at that age,
right.
I knew that I was going to be doing something that tied into that.
That's really interesting, and I know just you're reading a little bit about your history. There comes a period, maybe in more in your like teenage years or later years, where you begin to step in and begin to organize some events. There's one march that I remember reading about, 1965, with Dwight Williams at Temple. I don't know if you could talk about like, what leads us into this moment.
Yeah. Well, I graduated from high school in 1963. But let me step back, actually, because one, the high school I went to, Thomas Edison High School, was academically was considered one of the worst high schools in the city, and it was all boys. It was interracial. It pulled from the working class families, both in North Philadelphia and East Philadelphia. Again, segregated housing kept us from interacting with each other after school, but during school, we were engaged. And but the thing about Thomas Edison that's significant, that historically significant, is that it had the highest per casualty rate of any high school in the country as it relates to the war in Vietnam. So that more. In fact, there's a plaque. Like if you go to 8th and Lehigh, the school.
I did not know this.
Yeah, so that my high school, more people died nationally, not just in Philly, than any other high school in the country per capita. Thomas Edison High, and I mean it's been moved now to another location.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that that's one thing I do want to point out.
Right.
And the other thing about prior to high school was because of Bill Crawford and the books that he was giving me, I began reading about African American history. I mean, which was just opening up a whole new world to me, because I mean, I knew virtually nothing. I knew Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, but knew nothing about the struggles of African Americans.
We got to dig in here for a minute.
Yeah,
Let's talk about Bill Crawford's bookstore, New World. What are these books? What books are you reading at this time?
I know he gave me, the Communist Party used to have a theory of that it was a black nation in the South. So there's a book called
Henry Winston?
Harry Haywood.
Haywood.
Right, Harry Haywood wrote the Negro National Question. I read that. When the first volume of Herbert Aptheker's documentary series, African American History, came out, I got a copy of that. Bill gave it to me. He gave me a lot of Marxist literature written by Lenin. Most particularly, I didn't understand a lot of it, but I was fascinated by the concept, because the one thing I always knew about the communists was that their anti-racist stance and policies were like none other in terms of an integrated group.
Right.
So that I was always struck by that. And the book Black Moses came out sometime during that period on Marcus Garvey. I was reading about that. And it's so interesting because I would go to my teachers in high school, I was reading this stuff like, wow, did you know this or did you know that? And it was like new to them, totally new to them.
Yeah.
They just did not know anything. And I'm reminded that I grew up in the period of McCarthyism. And I'm sure that had some bearing on my educational experience.
Yes.
In terms of the limitations that even a progressive teacher would have had during those days. So that I was just kind of ensconced in this, these few books at the time that I was just reading over and over again.
And are you like we are in We are in West Philadelphia, so there's always going to be a dirt bike or something that's going to go by. So if you hear the sound, just know. Were you like the sole young person, sort of like as these conversations are happening, or is there like a crew of young people maybe that are coming into this bookstore and building like study groups or?
No, in fact, I'm not even. Yeah, I don't recall meeting any. Well, one I used to go there on Sundays.
Okay.
So that I wasn't because of where I lived and all. So, and I don't recall a lot of people being in there, but although it was a well-stocked store, and Bill just was so welcoming. I mean, he was just so excited. I'm not going to go into the story, but when he would talk to me about Paul Robeson and when he tried to have a concert in upstate New York at Peekskill, Bill was one of the bodyguards for it. And I never heard of this, of course.
Yes.
And then he would talk to me about various other social movements that I just had no context, no history for. But like at that point, I was more or less in my own head.
Right.
But then, I would somehow or another I wound up on a lot of mailing lists.
Got you.
And there was a group. There was a meeting once that was held not far from where I was living. That was organized by the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM, that was led by then Max Stanford, now Muhammad Ahmed, and I went to a meeting that he had, and met a lifelong friend of mine, Dwight Williams, there, and so that was really the first time that I really was able to engage with other people about things that have been floating in my head, and so that was my context.
Yes.
When I went to Temple University when I first started.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So it sort of like jumps, the knowledge that's being gathered and sort of begins to jump out of those books into those experiments. And shout out to Dr. Muhammad Ahmed and the work. And I also think of we got Hakeem's bookstore that's still open right across the street. There's still the influence that Max Stanford at that time had with Dawood Hakeem and building up that black bookstore over there. Man, the Bill Crawford store. We can talk about that. Like just that ecosystem of black knowledge that influenced and was an addition to what folks were not engaging with in schools in some ways.
Exactly.
So you get to Temple University.
Yeah, but that should also add that that I used to go. There was it's still there, I guess, a place called Heritage House on Broad Street, and there was a group of, and the head of it was Dr. Eugene Raymond Jones, an amazing figure who needs a biographer, as far as I'm concerned. And Dr. Jones had a group of young people from throughout the city, young African Americans, not a lot of us, who it was just a place for us to come together and to intellectually interact. And relative to the other people, they were a couple years older than me, which back in those days, when you got 15 and somebody's 17 and you're 16, that's a lot of years in your mind. And they would have all sorts of conversations now that was just amazing. And looking back on it, because these were folks who were talking about cybernetics and computers. This is in the early 60s.
Yes.
And they were people who had gone to Simon Gratz High School, other similarly situated high schools. These were not private school students, if you will. And which goes to show you, by the way, that the talent of African Americans is rooted in who we are and not on those experiences, because a lot of people judge folks by, you mentioned, well, I went to Harvard or I went to Penn. Yeah. And, I always tell people, look, there are some smart people who go to college. Yes. But college does not make you smart. You have to work at that. Yes. And so to that degree, these were some brilliant people that I used to just almost literally sit at their feet. And they were only a couple years older than me. And back in those days, the civil rights movement was beginning to garner press attention. And while I was too young to appreciate both the Montgomery bus boycott, which and I kind of heard of Martin Luther King, but the Freedom Rides really caught my attention when people were doing that. And then the sit-ins really caught my attention.
You're right.
And then there was a big movement in Albany, Georgia, back in '62, I think. And a lot of, well, not a lot, but there were significant people from Philadelphia who went there. There was an African-American woman named Prathy Hall. There was a white woman named Joyce Barrett. There was a guy named John Churchfield. And they were all in the South. Working, and I would hear their names, and people knew them. Right. And when they came back to Philly, I would listen to these conversations. So I was really geared up to do something. I just didn't know what to do or how to do it. Right. And so that leads me to Temple University. Selma occurred in my sophomore year, and like everyone else, I was just shocked. I mean, this is after Birmingham and the dogs and the church being bombed in Alabama, so that we were trying to organize some solidarity. And Dwight and I, and we were both sophomores at the time, were able to engage some faculty, some other students, and we organized a march from Temple University to City Hall in solidarity with the struggle of Selma, and that was a very big deal, and my first organizing, I guess, attempt. And I don't want to exaggerate my skill level, but it worked. It worked.
I think about I think that moment jumped out to me because I come from like education organizing in Philadelphia, and I would read about like in 1967 there's this huge student walkout in Philadelphia. Oh, nice. When it faces a mass repression that's led by the police commissioner at the time, Frank Rizzo, who eventually becomes mayor, and that this was a protest up and down Broad Street was something that, was almost like a traditional or like a path that was understood. It was a new way of sort of thinking about that moment. But yeah, I was thinking about that 67 student walkout and that generation, for me, of black youth in Philadelphia. Some names like, Walt Palmer, David P. Richardson, and others. This out of the outcome is like Cecil B. Moore's influence in Philadelphia. We're seeing this rising generation of civil rights, black power leadership really come to a head in Philadelphia.
In fact, Cecil was very important. That there's now it's a high school. It was a junior high when it first got built. Strawberry Mansion High School at 33rd and Ridge. And when they were building it, Cecil Moore, under the NAACP, organized a protest to try to get more African American workers. And that was my first demonstration because it was only 2 blocks from where I lived. And in fact, the only time I ever played hooky from school was to go to this.
You went to another school, right?
Yeah. And in fact, Max or Muhammad Ahmed was got beat up there. It became a confrontation with the police.
Oh wow!
Actually, and so that the protest was in the air at that point throughout the country, and it was just a question of folks finding a niche in terms of it. And so that after we did Dwight and I. After we did the a demonstration in support of Selma, we went south because I was intent on joining SNCC when school was over. I didn't know how to do it because I would have gone in 1964 to Mississippi. I just had no idea what to do, how to do it, and so I just decided we just decided to go to Atlanta. And we just drove there on a whim, but didn't know anyone. And went to the SNCC office, and as fate would have it, we actually met John Lewis. In fact, I would like to tell people the first week I ever stayed in Atlanta, I stayed with John. And there was another, some other SNCC activists there.
Yes.
Jimmy Travis, who was from Mississippi, who had been shot in the head in a failed assassination attempt to kill Bob Moses. Worth Long, who was an internationally acclaimed musicologist, but who also organized the first SNCC group in Arkansas.
Yes.
And so instead of going to Mississippi, they encouraged us to go to Arkansas. And so, and like I didn't care where I went. And when school was up in '65, took a bus to Arkansas, and my life hasn't been the same since.
We'll go deep into the SNCC story. Then I realized, talking about my organizing skill set, I didn't go grab waters from next door to help us to make us through this conversation.
Well, so far so good.
So far so good, but at some point we'll take a small break to kind of go grab some things. I'll show you the keys real quick. So it's one of these. When you go to the back kitchen, you can go into the refrigerator. Thank you. God bless volunteers. Support.
Watch you record.
I'm about to tether myself.
So, so you, and I also realized that you mentioned that your parents they have this sort of like South connection. So I'm thinking about leaving from Philadelphia, traveling to Arkansas. Is this like, is it a cultural shock? Like, what's the differences between what's happening in Philadelphia and the sort of like ecosystem of what's happening in Arkansas at the time?
Yeah, well, for me at least, while they were clearly there back then, not so much today, but back then, there were clearly cultural differences amongst African Americans between North and South. But because I had gone South a few times when I was growing up, I didn't really see that. I mean, because the people that I worked with in Arkansas, a lot of them were much poorer than I was, and on the one hand, but then there were people in my family, like for example, my grandmother never had indoor plumbing, just as an example, which and that a lot of my cousins in the South didn't wear shoes unless they were going to school or church. So I'd seen various levels. So things weren't shocking to me. In that regard, the food was the same, literally the same. So I didn't really experience a lot of that difference. What I experienced was the virulence of racism that compared to the North. I mean, it was it was just another level. Yeah. And that while I never let it control me, but I mean I was scared every day. I mean it's hard to recreate the danger of the South in those days. And now like I'm talking to someone. I mean I'm someone who didn't grow up in it, but I mean the most innocuous things could cause you death. I mean, literally death, and so that there were certain customs that I did not adhere to, and just very calling someone Mister or having or moving off the sidewalk. I mean, just basic human interactions. But by and large, you are always conscientious about your safety and what could happen to you. I mean, there's a story that I tell to point that out. I mean, if you want to take a second. I had been I worked in a place called Helena, Arkansas, which is called Phillips County, Arkansas, which was the county where there had been a pogrom in 1919. It's very famous. There's the books on it now, but at the time, I had never heard of it. It's called the Lane Massacre, where as a result of trying to organize to increase their pay, a group of sharecroppers were basically massacred and by whites in the county.
So these are black sharecroppers who are organizing to.
Right. And,
wow.
Right. And it's called the Lane Massacre. If you want to look it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, without going, but that's the county that I worked in. Because we worked in places like Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Forest City, but I worked in Helena. And there was a white SNCC worker who had married an African-American woman. And that became a statewide issue. Everyone knew this person's name, Bill Hanson. And so, and the state troopers almost had a lottery on who would kill him first. I mean, that's the level. Oh, no, this, I'm telling you, it was madness.
Yes.
So, but one day, most of my time in Arkansas, I was in the black community. Seldom did we interact with whites unless there was a protest. So that, but one day I had to go into the town with driving a car that Bill Hanson drove to change a part that had been purchased. And so I'm in the store and purely just trying to do a commercial transaction. And there's some guys in the store, and a man says, the guy behind the counter says, isn't that Hanson's car? Well, as soon as he said that, my antennas went up. And as he said that, he was reaching under the counter. So instinctively, and these guys were getting the crowd around him.
Yeah.
Instinctively, I just got burst out of the place and went to, and jumped into my car. The guy behind the counter comes to the, it's funny now, but it wasn't funny. Comes to the door with a gun, and he's pointing it at me in a very deliberate way. I'm leaning over, trying to start my car.
Oh, Lord. I see it's like a movie.
No, this is like a movie that, I mean, we're talking about seconds that lasted a year.
Yes.
And, so I drive off, right? And then, so when I get back to the SNCC Freedom House, talk to my colleague, who say, well, we got to report this, right? So I go down to the sheriff to report what happened, and the guy who had pulled the gun had beat me there. So I'm not sure what he told the police, but they arrested me for disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct.
Oh, wow.
And they had a trial and convicted me. Now, the guy never got anything done to him, anything. And they gave me a suspended sentence, told me to leave the state, which I didn't do.
Yeah.
But, SNCC used to report these incidents to the FBI. So I go to the FBI person in Little Rock to talk about this incident. And believe it or not, this FBI man name was Smart, Agent Smart. And so he was engaging. We had this long conversation, talked about my upbringing and different things. And so I'm really feeling like positive. Not that anything is going to happen, but this is just a recording. Hopefully that the accumulation might be used in a court case down the road. So we part, and that was like in August or late July of '65. In September of '65, when school started, in another city where there was a SNCC project, there was we were trying to integrate the school system. They had arrested like 200 students, the key SNCC organizer, and we really had created this trauma in the community. Right. And so about eight of my SNCC comrades were in what we call the Freedom House, the house that we all lived in, and trying to plan some strategy. And there was a white woman who was a SNCC volunteer who was also in the group. And one night, the police come, right? And they like bang on the door, bam, 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 bam. I mean, really intense, right? So when we opened the door, it's about, 20 25 police, and they throw us up against the wall, had our hands all leaning, and I didn't know what was going to happen. So in the back of the police line, who do I see but Agent Smart, the FBI guy.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, wow. So I said, Agent Smart, and before I could complete a sentence, he says, "Shut up, you black MF, and you stand up against that wall." And I'm like, what? I thought we were friends. And you know, that capsulizes what we're dealing with. Because I always ask people, what do you do when you can't go to the police?
Yes.
I mean, what do you do?
Right.
You know, I mean, that's supposed to be the guardians. And what do you do when you can't go to the police? And that's basically the environment that people lived under. Mine was anecdotal. Right. Because I didn't live there. Right. In any extended sense. So that's just tells you what it was like.
So what was it like during that, like, to face this repressionist violence? You know, you had these visions, and you've been reading and engaging with ways of transforming society, and then in the midst of, you're all young people facing this. What does that do in terms of, like, challenging your? Is there points? Are there moments of doubt? Does it only, like, reinforce the commitment? What's happening there as you're? No,
it reinforces the commitment. But I do want to just make a point though too, is that, you know, when people write about the civil rights movement, particularly whites in the civil rights movement, and by civil rights movement now I'm talking about the South. They tend to but whites and blacks, but particularly whites, but we tend to get exalted. And people tend to think that before we got there, nothing was going on. And I always try to stress to people that that there was always a movement. It's just that nobody cared. So that, you know, when they were looking for Emmett Till back in '55, that they found bodies in the river that they weren't even looking for. So that, and similarly, when they killed Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, they found black bodies that they weren't looking for. So that there was always protest. The problem, the thing that we did, those of us not from there, was to highlight the protest, so that when I wound up in jail a few times, for an example, in the South, the Enquirer had a little paragraph about it or something, so that whereas nobody would know about a local person from Arkansas being in jail or Mississippi. Now I should add that a lot of the SNCC workers were indigenous, and that's a whole nother story, particularly in Mississippi. But by and large, it's important to note that there were continual struggles in the 20th century before we ever got down south. Yeah. And in many ways, we joined that struggle and were able to highlight it. Right. Yeah. Man. The other thing I think is important about SNCC, and you know, that I now say, not then, but now, that the process of liberation is as important as being liberated. Now, when I say that it's not a question of if you have an oppressed people in a community, and someone comes from without that community and is able to do any number of things to improve that condition, if the people think you did it, then things haven't changed as far as I'm concerned. And so the profoundness of SNCC, and I should just mention Ella Baker in terms of who I consider the founder of SNCC. The profoundness of SNCC was a sense that people have to take that leadership. So it's not a question of Michael Simmons from Philadelphia being the king of Helena, Arkansas. It's a question of me identifying people and helping them take their rightful place in their community.
Yeah. I really appreciate that too. And I don't know if I shared this with you. So my father's family, I grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania, but my father's family is from West Helena, Arkansas.
Really?
Uh-huh.
That's where I work, man.
Word. Yeah. So we went
Really?
one time. My brother had a basketball tournament in Memphis, and we ended up, stopping by my one of my aunt's house in West Helena. I remember Kroger. That's pretty much all I got. But figuring out that, and now I gotta talk about this.
Wow.
I gotta look up this Lane
What's
Massacre.
the family name? Do you know?
Rogers.
Oh, okay, no.
Yeah.
Oh, but the Lane Massacre. In fact, there are books on that now. Don't know.
Yeah.
Which, not in terms of quantity, but qualitatively, was as bad as Tulsa, or except that they didn't drop bombs. But wow, man, you threw me off there. Wow.
When I was reading a little bit, I was like, we did go there one time, but just making that connection. They left when my dad might have been 8 or 9 years old.
No, I can see why he left.
Yeah.
I know that.
Right.
No, because it was and again, what you find amongst African Americans, and in particular, but especially, is that, that we should always exalt the culture, and that people, because there's a vision that people have of oppressed people, of kind of woe is me and I can't do anything, and it's never that.
Yeah.
Wherever it is, be it South Africa, be it here, it's never that. There's always people who say no, who are willing to struggle.
Yes.
And that I always give the example of, if you look at that, a lot of people in the movement, particularly whites, but also African Americans too, tend to look at people as, kind of thinking like, well, they won't understand this issue, or, like nuclear weapons, let's say, or the environment. And my view is that not only will they understand it, they are thinking about it too. But, and I say, if you take like the street that I currently am staying on, or living on, my family home, that there's a stretch where there's 2 blocks with no impediment to cars. The cars just speed down there, and there's a school right across the street. Now, I always tell folks, I say, because I always try to point out to people, I say, now, because you're dealing with people who have to put in an enormous amount of effort just to get a stop sign. Now, if you go around Drexel and Penn, and do you see these ridges in the street, or speed bumps? We don't have no speed bumps, none. Schools are everywhere. There's not one.
Yes.
Now, so I say, so you're dealing with the people, you say, if they can't get a stop sign, then they damn sure don't think they can do anything about nuclear weapons.
Right.
But I said, but that doesn't mean that they don't think. And I tell people that our role is not so much to teach, but to get them to see that what they think matters. Because as soon as people realize, like, oh damn, we can do something about this, then like you can step aside. Yeah. Because it's not like it's not on their minds. And I always refer to the barbershop conversations, or any your research, in terms of storytelling, that that people don't think that they can do anything, and that's what we have to do, is to say, oh no, we can do something. Like this.
And I want to think about that because one of the videos that I watched online from a previous SNCC conference, you talked about almost like the transition in SNCC being of like thinking of from civil rights to Black power. I think it's kind of like narrativized from from the historian point of view. But I would love to hear from your perspectives, because how is that transition happening within the movement, amongst organizers? What's happening there where Black power and Kwame Ture and the influence of that really comes to a head?
Well, it's my contention. People talk about the civil rights movement as an integrated movement, and it was. But but if you look at it and you go break it up into periods, and I'm talking about now from the Montgomery bus boycott forward. I'm not going back before that, but which it was basically a black movement, clearly. But even, say, from 60 to 64, 65, or well 60 to 63, 64, it was a black movement with some white people in it. In 1964, when they had the Freedom Summer, and 1,000 white people came in to the state of Mississippi primarily, that's when it became an integrated movement. And now you asking me about, if I had any cultural shocks. Well, just imagine middle-class white people coming into the South during that period. I mean, they just had no idea at any level. And so that it was the first time that many African Americans interacted with white people in any kind of social activity, so that there was a almost inherent what's the best way to characterize it, relationship where the African Americans looked up to the white people. They thought they were smarter, they thought they were prettier. Right. Back in those days, we were still talking about good hair and bad hair.
Right.
And, we back in those days, you still could get a fight if you called another black person black. So that in that context, here comes these white people, and they have all these skills. So that the young African American from Helena or from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who might have been typing 20 words a minute, then you got this person from Stanford who can type 120 words a minute. So then they supplant them. So you step back and say, well, look, she types faster, so she should be doing it. But the issue was to get people to change the way they view themselves and the way they viewed white people. So that was one of the negative legacies, as far as I'm concerned, of 1964 and the Summer Project, was that there was a sense of gratitude to whites who had come into the movement, and in a way that my support and activism around gay and lesbian issues, nobody owes me anything.
Right.
I do that because it's the right thing to do. I'm not trying to do anybody a favor.
Right.
And similarly, so that when I moved to Atlanta late 65, along with other people to address the Julian Bond's campaign, without going into that right now, that we began to talk about how deferential the black community had been and was being to white supporters. And we were saying that just was not a healthy thing to do.
Yes.
And that's the consciousness that Black Power emerged out of. That trying to get African Americans to see that they were just as capable as a white person.
Right.
As I tell people, education is a function of opportunity. But because someone is illiterate does not mean that they aren't intellectually sharp. And I think about my mother in that regard, who wasn't illiterate, but she dropped out of school in the 6th grade. So that so getting people to understand the power that they had, and that created a intense schism in the civil rights movement amongst blacks and whites, where people were suggesting that proponents of Black Power hate white people and didn't appreciate white people, and it was like, no, we just think it's important that African Americans see that they need to determine their destiny, and it doesn't have to be a separate destiny. And in fact, our challenge to white people were, bring us some white people. Don't just come by yourself. Yes. And I always say, when somebody gets shot, somebody helps the wounded, but somebody got to get the killer.
Right.
And like y'all know him better than we do. So and that was a continual struggle. In fact, if you look at the historiography of the civil rights movement,
right,
for every like one of the most dynamic movements in the civil rights movement, as far as I'm concerned, was Albany, Georgia. I don't think there's one book on Albany, Georgia. If you look at the struggles in Atlanta, there are more books, but not if you look at Arkansas, the first book on the civil rights movement, at least in terms of SNCC, in Arkansas was published in 2011. It's called Arsenic. But there are a million books on Mississippi.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot get
Right.
And it's because that was the concentration of white people.
Yeah.
Well, no. Let me step back. It's not just because of that. Because what happened in Mississippi was profound. So I don't want to just minimize it or
Right. Yeah, true.
But the point that I'm making, though, is that it's not so much that the books on Mississippi are not valid. It's just that there were any number of struggles that have just gotten ignored by history. And so, but that's the context of Black Power. Yeah.
And I also think about what also I think is so appreciated and why we get so many books about SNCC is y'all commitment to documentation. Y'all had reports and that was such an important factor of why those moments I kind of return to and so much. But another transition I want to talk about is moving into Black Power, and this kind of goes back to what you mentioned about Edison High School and its relationship to the Vietnam War. Right? Is we're also seeing this internationalist critique, this anti-imperialist critique come through SNCC and really, affect the entire movement. And I know, I was reading about your experience with the draft and the consequences of such things. But could you talk about that anti-imperialist critique and maybe share a little bit about that story of the draft and everything about that?
Yeah, that, well, one, in terms of going back again to, as I learned more about Robertson, W.B. Du Bois, the work that Malcolm X did during the last year of his life, that I began to really look internationally at struggles. The Cuban Revolution had a big effect on progressive African Americans. The UN was a much more significant institution than it is today. And there was the Bandung Conference of non-aligned movement in the 50s. So I was aware of these things, and they were having an effect on me. That in, I guess, somewhere around 66 or so, the book, The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, really had an impact on many. In fact, that had an impact on the evolution of Black Power because he talked about the colonial mentality. And and in terms of Vietnam, it was just, people, there was just no question in my mind that I wasn't going into the Army. Had there not been a war in Vietnam, I wasn't going into the Army, period. But politically, you can always see that the people who support foreign intervention throughout the 20th century were also some of the most ardent segregationists in the U.S. So that there was a clear relationship between those two realities, which I might add. Another thing I like just to challenge is this. Historians talk about the multiracial civil rights movement and the white anti-war movement, which is just ridiculous. Ridiculous that the African American anti-war movement took on different forms, but there was always an African American anti-war consciousness. Again, we didn't know what to do. We were trying to avoid jail as a community, as were whites, but though we didn't have, or at least we didn't know how to even get a passport back in those days, let alone going to Canada or some other countries. But nevertheless, African Americans were opposed to the war too. Those who went in just felt that because they didn't want to go to jail. So having said that my own experience was trying to develop some organized consciousness within SNCC, because SNCC was always anti-war, but we hadn't really developed institutions to challenge it. And in Atlanta, the Atlanta project of SNCC, we developed some work in the grassroots where we were talking to, it was kind of like anti-draft counseling, but and we started protesting at the Atlanta Draft Board. And it's a long story, but to make it short, the day of my introduction into the Army, which I had changed from Philadelphia to Atlanta, we were arrested, and we being about 12 of us, two women and 10 men, and spent 2 months in jail there. And as a result, I thought that I had to worry about going into the Army. And it turned out that they were intent on me not so much going into the Army, going into the Army or going to jail. So I got indicted for refusing to report for induction and was convicted. And there was a 2-year period of fighting it legally, but I wound up spending close to 3 years. That started out at Allenwood and wound up in Lewisburg because we were organizing in jail, which is a whole nother story. We had a very dynamic organizing in jail.
Oh man, one day we'll have to recover those things as well. I always think about that and the role that SNCC played, and there's a lot that is. Martin Luther King's Vietnam speech is amazing.
No, it is.
But not much is made of how SNCC and the Black student anti-war movement influence what would come to be that moment. So thank you.
In fact, there's one point I want to make about that, because SNCC wrote a anti-Vietnam War speech late 65, early 66. And if you look at that, not speech, but policy paper. If you look at that policy paper and you compare it to other progressive groups of the period, the thing that distinguishes SNCC's paper from other groups was that it wasn't just a critique of the war in Vietnam. We talked about Latin America, we talked about Africa, we talked about Cuba, so that there was a sense that Vietnam was not an aberration, that it was a continuation of U.S. foreign policy. Yeah, in that regard,
So, when does your sort of like transition out of SNCC sort of begin?
In 67, I guess.
67?
Yeah. And was kind of adrift for a while after being in SNCC, and wound up going back to school in 68, going back to Temple, which I thought I wouldn't ever do, but I did. But by then, both Dwight Williams and myself, we were along with other students, we were able to. Well, there was a Black Student League that was very small, and by then I was reading a lot of international stuff about the United Front against Nazism that had written by Mao Zedong and the Communist Party and all. And out of that came what we call the Steering Committee for Black Students at Temple University, where we said, look, every organized group can maintain its own integrity, don't have to change anything, but we're going to get a larger group made up of representatives from all the fraternities and sororities and social service groups, and to try to develop a Black History program. And also though we developed a program that where we had a Black orientation for incoming students. We developed a partnership so that, because our thing was, look, even if you're not political, even if you're just here to get good grades, you should be willing to mentor someone who's majoring in what you're majoring in.
Yes.
So even if you don't want to be bothered with the politics, if you're studying biology and this person wants to be an undergraduate in biology, then you should at least mentor. So that, and then we had a what we call a mass publication called the what's it called? It was I forget all of a sudden. I wanted to say it wasn't the final call, but
Muhammad Speaks.
No. This was a student.
Oh, okay.
Student developed.
We got a Temple AFAN person in the building. Maybe they can help us.
Yeah, that all this stuff is in Temple archives because some people have done research and have called me about it. But we had a mass publication that we did, and we had what we call a theoretical journal that was scholarly. And I mean, it was an amazing group of people in terms of students, and we were able to engage. I would say 70-80% of the African American students, I mean, were involved, and it led to what is now the Black Studies program at Temple.
Yeah,
we used to. They kind of gutted it over the years, but we had a affirmative action program at Temple that we said that we want to pull from the bottom third of the graduating class with remedial help, and because we figured the top are going to get in anyway.
Right.
And so that was unique.
Yes.
And we were trying to, although we weren't that successful, but we were trying to organize a regional student alliance with schools in the area. But we weren't able to do that. But it was a very dynamic movement.
Yeah. You know, Temple's African American or Black Studies program has been so influential in Philadelphia. I definitely going to give a shout out to Dr. Anthony Montero, who's a huge fan and someone who works with the house, and the work that they do over there is just so important. So thanks for making that connection back to that story. And I guess the next point that I have in my notes is kind of looking at this transition into international work, you know, and working with the AFSC. I don't know how close that is to that period.
No. Well, not to that period. But I met people from AFSC in jail when I was doing my conscientious objection day. Some who were Quakers, Quaker activists, I should say, not just religious Quakers, but activists. But their Quakerism led them to activism, and that led me to. I'm just trying to tell a long story short.
We should probably. Please continue to put. Has people been providing questions for us? A little bit.
So far, just a lot of thanks and gratitude, but people should feel encouraged to pose questions.
Yeah, Phil, please, you know, we're going to start to build up those questions. We'll come to in a minute.
But anyway, I started working at the American Friends Service Committee when I got out of jail. And it was primarily domestic work where with the genius of a late friend of mine by the name of Tyree Scott. Anybody that goes to Seattle, they mention that name in the progressive community, they'll know him. That had started a protest around getting people of color, particularly African Americans, but not exclusively, into the building trades in Seattle. Led to a long, protracted struggle. To make a long story short, they won a court case that allowed them to become objectively a union hall, so that it wasn't just the union that supplied the workers, but it was also this community organization. That's because the union kept saying they couldn't find any workers. So anyway, as a result of that, we organized a group in the Southwest, in Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, called the Workers Federation. And we used to, and the idea was to organize community groups around class action, employment, discrimination lawsuits. Because one of the problems with the legal work in the progressive community is that poor people aren't allowed to treat their lawyers the way that rich people treat their lawyers, in the sense that rich people, like poor people, are used almost as I can't find the right word, but they would take the case, but not stay in touch. Mm-hmm. And when you build, well, one, that's bad, but when you're trying to build a movement, that's even worse. And like our view was that poor people should be able to treat their lawyers the way rich people treat them. We tell them what to do. They don't tell us. We tell them what we want to do in our case. And sometimes it might not be the smartest legal strategy, but it might be the smartest strategy for building a movement.
Yes.
So that we had so much trouble with lawyers that we started a law firm. That's still in existence today, I might add, in Seattle.
Oh, wow.
I mean, this is like started in 74, 75. See
Yes.
how long ago that was. And called the Northwest Employment Law Office. And where the workers control the lawyers. And so while we were doing that work, it was all during the period of the liberation movements in Africa, along with the war in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And the whites who were focused on that kind of work never saw the African American community as a constituency. And we did. So that, for an example, when Salvador Allende was overthrown in Chile in 72, 73, that we were able to organize black workers to support that, to protest at federal institutions, that all during the work of Namibia, the liberation struggle, Angola, Mozambique, etc., we were organizing African American workers on that and the domestic, because our position was there's always a link. It's not domestic and international, and it's like white people used to tell me during the Anti-Vietnam War, they would say you can't link Mississippi with Vietnam, and my view was, how could you not link Mississippi with Vietnam? Was always my view. So that we were able, so that my and others' consciousness of the linkages of the international issue, and the fact that you could discuss these issues with people who were never seen in university.
Yes.
And I mean, that's the important thing. That people think that knowledge just comes from one source.
Right.
And I tell people, when you look at published African American writers in the 20th century, that 15, 20% of them didn't start writing till they were in jail.
Yeah.
So that that when you look at our experiences, that the talent gets overlooked.
Yes.
The talent gets ignored. So that so that we always worked at treating our community with respect, and that, like, regardless of anything that happened before, you treat folks with respect, and see what you get. Out of that, I became head of the Southern Africa program, and that was just an enormous amount of work, particularly around divestment in South Africa. There was a lot of opposition to divestment, and a lot of people who were used to oppose it.
Right.
The Reverend Leon Sullivan, back in the days of the divestment movement, was opposed to it. And was a very formidable foe.
Yeah. And what years is this? Because
this was 77 to into the 80s. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because my only thing of the divestment movement, I think of Spike Lee's School Days.
Oh, yeah.
But
that was very.
I think it's important to have those linkages, because
it's a very dynamic movement.
The work that we do at the Robertson House, and recovering the work of the Council of African Affairs, Alphaeus Hunt and W.B. Du Bois and Robertson, amongst many others, were there being those linkages to those movements and seeing that work still continue. With new generation.
And some of the material that was developed during that time, particularly We Charge Genocide.
Yes.
It's a seminal work, for I'm concerned. Along with the writings of Robertson, who was very involved with the decolonization movement.
Right.
So that those people who came before us Du Bois's The World in Africa. So
Yes.
that, all of that played into, at that point, I began to have a context for what I was reading.
So this is interesting. I would like to talk about just like what you're seeing in the 70s and the 80s with the African liberation movements and the lessons that you're sort of still working with of what's happening with black movements in the U.S. and those connections.
Yeah, well, again, that some of the liberation leaders and representatives were coming here. Amelia Carter Ball spoke at Lincoln University. Amelia Carter Ball from Guinea-Bissau,
Gotta find this.
Cape Verde. There were representatives from South Africa, exiles living here in Philly at the time. One in particular is gone back now. I think whose name? Oh goodness, story escapes me. But the person who became the foreign minister of Namibia used to live here. Theo. Oh man.
Like here, like Philadelphia, or here?
Yeah,
like,
no, here in Philly. Yeah. But anyway, there was this activity. We organized. I was a part of a local anti-liberation, pro-liberation, anti-racism.
Right, like anti-apartheid. Yeah.
As a result of my associated with the American French Servicemen, I was able to go to Cuba with a U.S. delegation to support the Angolan country as it became independent, and so that my consciousness was really not just a building, but at this point I had an outlet for what I thought for things that need to be done. And I should say, anytime I say I may say I, it's never I.
Yes.
It's always we.
Right.
So I might say I did, but it's never I. I didn't do anything by myself. The one thing, again, by looking at African American talent, it's a long story to tell you how we wound up with this. But when I was in jail in Callenwood, I was able to engage my fellow convicts who were not conscience objectors into celebrating African American History Month, and we wound up writing a play that was a satire on antisocial behavior in the black community, and the play was a collective effort, and the play was so good that they actually is again the administrative parts of it are not significant, but we actually went to Bucknell University and performed it, and we had 30 speaking parts.
Yes.
Set designs.
Right.
It was just an unbelievable event because the thing that made it unbelievable for me is you had people who had never done, including me, but I wasn't in the same situation because I'd been to plays. These folks had never seen anything. They'd never been on the college campus.
Right.
So it was just such a dynamic experience for all engaged. And again, I always tell people, and I used to work here in Philly, a group called Crisis Intervention Network years ago that was dealing with gangs and street neighborhood conflicts. And I would speak to teachers. And the question I always think about is, you mean to tell me that somebody who develops a talent for writing poetry didn't get out of the junior high school? So you mean no teacher can identify this? It's just like today, that's the one thing that every school should be able to teach in the era of hip hop is poetry.
Yes. You
mean to tell me you can't teach poetry in the era of hip hop? I mean, it's
true.
But it's because people don't respect our culture. So I say that, okay, so let's say you don't like hip hop.
Right.
But you start where people are at.
Yes.
And you can take them to Chaucer or Shakespeare. I mean, I'm not saying stay there.
Right.
But at least people, and to expand that horizon.
Yes.
But people never start where we're at because where we're at is not valued.
Right.
At all.
And Robertson was huge on that, of like connecting this shared genealogy of music that, begins out of Africa and travels across civilizations and is, adapted and muted, and we remix it, they remix it, but it connects us and unites us to understand that these things travel and we're connected and we're speaking to one another and having conversations with one another all throughout our time here. So
and
I appreciate that.
Just one point about that. This something my wife, Linda Carranza, pointed out to me just recently, is that the banjo comes out of Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, think about how most black folks view the banjo.
Yeah.
As some racist, West Virginia, blah, blah, blah. It comes out of Africa.
Yes.
And you think about it in terms of music, the universality of music in terms of, like I call what is known in this country as country music, I call it white blues. Mm-hmm. And then, or if you look at music, and I point that out living in Europe, that African Americans in less than 100 years created at a minimum 5 distinct genres of music. If you go to the blues, you go to spirituals, gospels, you go into jazz, you go into rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and you go into hip hop.
Yeah.
That's us. And we don't even get to go to music school. Think about how many black folks I was just listening, who was it? Somebody, Kalani Smith, the organist.
Yes.
I listened to an interview. He just passed.
Okay, yeah.
He learned by ear. How many of our great musicians had to learn, but they couldn't even read the music because they didn't have access to it. It wasn't like they couldn't read the music.
Right.
They just didn't get access to the music.
Sure.
And not only is the music created, but you can't go anywhere in this world and not hear African American music.
Yes.
Some genre.
Yeah.
You get nowhere. And I've been living in the white world.
Right.
I mean, you can't go anywhere.
And you also sound like you've been doing a good radio show for a couple of years as well.
Right.
Shout out to Linda.
You're
doing that radio show. And I also would say for maybe some of our younger folks who may not know who Lonnie Smith is, Jay-Z's Dead Presidents. Listen to that song, begin there, think about that sample, and you can follow Lonnie Liston Smith's trajectory and his contributions to the world that way.
Yeah. And the, you look at here in Philadelphia, Rufus Harley, the bagpipes.
Right.
I mean, this, and again, we have to fight.
Yes.
For in order to do that, it's not like it's not like a merit system. It's not like a jump shot here.
Right.
Which we had to fight to do that too.
Yeah.
But you have to break through these folks. Always saying, I'm so glad that the Curtis Music School turned Nina Simone down. It's the benefit to us all.
And you mentioned now being in Europe now, and as the stories that we shared today, you're sort of still centered within Afro diasporic spaces. Can you talk about this transition and what's it been like taking those same lessons, that same organizing strategy, but now moving it into European spaces? I know Hungary is one of them, but there might be other.
Oh yeah, Hungary kind of came late for me at least. I started out doing work in the Soviet Union, but by doing work, taking small delegations to the Soviet Union for seminars, and then hosting the Soviet delegations in the U.S. Then I realized that, because this was during the Cold War, that those were bilateral seminars. I realized that we should be looking at how East-West tension impacted on the Third World in the era of the Cold War.
Yes.
So rather than have Soviets and Americans, I developed seminars with Soviets, American, Middle East, Soviet American, Latin America,
Yes.
Soviet American, Africa. And this was during the period of the breakup of the Soviet Union also. I was able to organize, well, my one trip to Africa was Zimbabwe, where we were able to get people from Southern Africa to participate together who were fighting each other.
Yeah.
But were able to participate together. Excuse me one second.
That's fine.
But
we're
to
organizing.
well, at the end of communism, I mean, think about communism for its shortcomings in Europe was that it clearly mitigated overt racism. And it was just so striking to me how after communism, how quickly the racism reemerged. It was just literally overnight. And so I began working on issues of the people that we in this country know as gypsies, formerly called Roma, R-O-M-A, not from Rome, but Roma, Romani. And so I've been for 25, 30 years, been working with that community. And again, when I say working, trying to take the experiences of African Americans and share it and say what out of this is useful to you. Because all of it isn't, but a lot of it is.
Yes.
Because the one thing you find when you travel anywhere in the world, if there are a group of oppressed people, regardless of ethnicity, they have some hero or shero from our movement. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I've been to places like Albania and Lithuania and Moldova, countries that people don't even know exist.
Yes.
And they know somebody.
Yes.
They may know Malcolm X. They may know, in fact, a lot of people know Paul Robeson.
Yeah, we just did a tour that we're talking about in Prague. In Prague, that Paul Robeson.
I had some people one time at a meeting from Tajikistan talking about he grew up listening to Paul Robeson records that his father had. But so I got a lot of stories there. But the point that I'm making, though, is that our struggle is a respected struggle. It's not just viewed through the prism of the United States. So to that degree, I've been able to share our experiences with other people in order to engage them in protest, some long term.
Just one second, let me make sure this battery's good where it needs to be. It's on. It's right here. Woo! We're back. All right.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And so that internationally, at least in Europe, that the work has been very multinational in the sense that both my wife and I work on issues of violence against women, LGBT rights, I'm sorry, and just generalizable xenophobia and racism. The work has, we started what we call a salon where prior to the pandemic, we were able to meet once a month or every 6 weeks or so with speakers on any topic you can name relating to human rights. In fact, it's been a while now, but one of our largest events was Dr. Clarence Hussein from Howard University, who wrote a book on Hitler's black victims, and that really drew an enormous gathering. But we talk about anything,
right?
More that the immigration problem in Hungary is very acute, and my wife worked for a very small group small in terms of personnel, large in terms of impact, of people trying to create some space for migrants in Hungary in terms of, and this is across the board from Africa to the Middle East. And it's just an amazing amount of work and very difficult work because Hungary is, which is where we've been living for about 18 years now. Hungary is, the president of Hungary is worse than Trump in a sense because he doesn't have the institutional guardrails that we have. I think we have. I'm not even sure.
Right.
But
But it says something about like even today in terms of like there is a transnational far right sort of nationalist
it's
fascist related movement that's been impacting not just this country but a lot of places across the globe, and particularly across the global north. Well,
so
sometimes in the south too.
It's so dangerous. I mean, in each eastern, I mean, the government of Hungary is as autocratic as any. I mean, they have gotten elected, but any of the institutions that allow opposition to emerge get stifled. In terms of clearly the media, but also the political space, so that it's a very dangerous trend that Trump is only the U.S. manifestation of it. Yeah, but he's not unique at all. Yeah.
So let's see if we got some did any questions come in? No, there's a lot of thank yous. This is good.
They're listening. I happen to be listening.
Oh, this is great. This is great. I wanted to. Do we have any questions from inside the room? These folks would like to share.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'll repeat it too, so you can just say it. I'll repeat it.
Oh, yeah. So, I'll ask just one question. We're learning a lot about young folk who came into the movement, and we're learning about their family, and how what their family structures were in terms of support. So I'm interested in knowing, I know it's just not you, but could you give us some type of, you're talking about, I think you said around 11 to 12 when you first go, to Arkansas. Your family, your family comes up north, of course, through the Great Migration to get away from some of those things, also economically. Can you talk about that? Like when you're telling your family, hey, and of your generation, I'm saying, right. Because most of the folk up north at this point are only one generation removed from being down south, and like you said, are still spending their summers down there. So can you talk about that? Not just how you're going down there for work, right? We're going down there to try to, can you talk about the community, be it religious communities, but also your families in terms of what was that kind of response and supports and cautionary tales that they may have kind of sent you with as well?
Thank you for that question.
Do you want to try to work in the question? Or you want me to do it?
Well, you do it.
So we talk about the role of family, in particular at a time, representing that he just left the South towards Philadelphia, which might not have been a change of complete transformation, representing racism was everywhere, but at the same time going back to the South. And choosing to sort of fight and confront the violence that in some ways the family was trying to escape. What does that say about the role of family and that influence on activists, the building activism and organizing?
That's a very good question. And that I can talk about my own personal situation first, but also a more general statement, which is not that much different, is that you're dealing with not just people who had just left the South, relatively speaking, in terms of having, my mother got to Philly around 1935, and 30 years later, I'm, headed back to where she came from, and my father, but similarly, and then I was in college, right? And by and large, while my older brother had gone to college, but in terms of my parents' two children, I was the first, and that it was traumatic for my mother, particularly my mother. My father had passed away earlier, but So here your child is in school. Everybody thinks that college is the pathway to freedom, justice, and equality, if you will. And then you dropping out of school and going down there. That as one who was, I proudly call myself a mother's boy. That was the one of the most traumatic interactions my mother and I had. I remember when I left my house, she went through my bag, taking out things. You can't take this with you, kid. But that I wasn't upset because I understood that emotion. My our former wife, who was from Memphis, Tennessee. I mean, her grandmother was just. They drove from Memphis to Atlanta. She was a Spelman student. To basically kidnap her. I mean, to take her back to Memphis. And her name is Dr. Zahara Simmons now. Zahara talked about somebody was to come to pick her up in Memphis to take her to Mississippi. In fact, the same guy who had married the black woman in Arkansas, the little tight circles there. And her grandmother sat on the porch with a gun. You know what I'm saying? A white man coming up by, so there was this dimension. And the thing I always point out when I talk about that is it comes out of love. It's not like they thought that the cause wasn't just. It's just that why did I want to sacrifice my child to this? I just left this. So that I'm sure there were families who were excited about, positively about that, but and they knew that. That it's one thing to know there's danger, but to experience it. It's one thing to read about it, but to really be in it. Like, one thing that I talk about is because there were incidents where whites at night would drive and shoot into cars. Literally shoot into cars. Mm-hmm. That it took me about 2 years. We'll put it this way. Back in those days, if you passed me at night, it's because what you were driving was faster than what I was driving. Mm-hmm. I didn't let any car pass me at night. I'd rather get a ticket because I was terrified. I did not go, but I didn't want anybody, because back then they used to carry shotguns in their pickup trucks. It was almost a cultural phenomenon that were just out and physical, nobody hiding them, so that there was that level of danger. Even if you know about it, it's a whole nother thing to experience it. It's like being in jail. Yeah, in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, we do have one question.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question online. Joy asks, beyond the movement for Black Lives, which I know has smartly engaged with veteran movement activists, are you or other SNCC and Black Power veterans engaged or available to be engaged in current African American led activism? So. And how to reach out to you? Yeah.
Well, I guess Chris can.
Yeah, you head up the Robeson House. We'll definitely be making those connections.
And one, two, that I should make clear that it's because of the pandemic that I'm here in the U.S. that I still pay rent in Budapest, Hungary. Mm-hmm. But I've been doing.
Still got a radio show there too.
Yeah, and I have a radio program there, and we work with this migrant organization there, so my being here is not, But having said that I am always available if I can help in any way. But I do want to mention one thing about that it does bring up to me, because that I think quite often we don't put enough balance to what we call elders or people who have come before us in the contemporary, so that I'm kind of sacrilegious about that. That because I always tell people that each generation will come up with strategies and tactics that the previous generation thinks, oh, that's crazy. Oh no, well, like we never did that. Or so that, and I always give the example. I mean, you know, at the time I didn't think about it because that's all I knew. But for a person living in the South, being told, okay, in Washington. You want to lead something. Because, you know, I mean, as much as I like it, people ain't listening to Sam Cooke right now. You know? So, in the context of the future, that I think that there are experiences that I bring to the table that people can learn from. But man, when I look at what went on over the last, not just last year with George Floyd, but even before that with Ferguson, there were things that we never thought of doing in terms of challenging the system. So that, like, when I talk to young folks, I do it humbly, and because I just have seen some of the most dynamic strategies I've ever seen in my life coming out of this generation that we never thought about. So there is a yin and yang to it. There is a level of teacher student, so that people of my generation need to be humbly recognize that we have some knowledge, but like we're just as much students as we are teachers.
So we want to try to close this around 1:45, but I do have one question, and then we can kind of. We got a few more questions in too. Well, how you feel?
I
okay. Well, I put 12-2 on the flyer. If you good, we can keep going.
Yeah, I'm cool.
So one question is, you mentioned Ella Baker. Black women like her were pivotal in these civil rights organizations, but they've gotten lost. Can you talk about their contributions in SNCC?
Yeah, I was even thinking that you mentioned the legacy of Zahara in SNCC and championing Black women's leadership. Yeah. We just did an event with her sometime during the pandemic, where we got to sort of like lift up her legacy as well. So
goodness, there is so much. African American women are on the bottom. So it's not just women, but it's like white men, white women, black men, black women, and that when I look at the civil rights, in fact, when you look at the civil rights movement, go to YouTube and you look at mass meetings that occurred in the South, and when the camera shoots not to the podium, but to the audience. And it's like overwhelmingly women. It's not like a few women. It's overwhelmingly women, over and over and over again. That when African American women have come to the fore, that they spend as much time fighting the sexism of African American men as they do fighting for African American men. So, and Ella Baker was the first executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the African American preachers did not want to listen to her. And she had to leave. That like Ella Baker was a visionary prophet. That prior to the '60s, she had been making contacts in the South for like 15 or 20 years for various organizations that laid the foundation for the community work that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did. That I look at women like Zahara Simmons, then known as Gwendolyn Robinson, Ruby Dodge Robinson, and others, and they were just dynamic leaders in their communities, and they were able to fight the sexism of their comrades in order to make their contributions. That we have just scratched the surface of one African American history, but in particular African American women's history. I mean, there is so much that we don't know. But that virtually every organization, just take Philadelphia for an example. I spent a significant amount of time in it, and you look at community organizations around the city, particularly around police brutality. Every time there's a spokesperson, it's a woman who is trying to organize and mobilize her community. That, like, I just think that African American women are just taken for granted. Those who go to Atlanta, Georgia, see that the streets have been changed, names have been changed. So you got Martin Luther King Street, you got Ralph Abernathy Street, you got Andy Young Street, you got Hosea Williams Street, and others. But there's no Ella Baker Street. There's no Fannie Lou Hamer Street. That a woman that I worked with in Arkansas, Carrie Dilworth, in the 30s was organizing a sharecroppers union in Arkansas, which was, again, tantamount to putting your head out there on a stake. That these are women who have yet to be acknowledged. I mean, unless you're studying the history, you may hear somebody here and there. You may finally heard about Fannie Lou Hamer. Ella Baker is beginning to get her due, but there are so many more. So that I just think that that's work that needs to be done.
And kind of pointing to the next generation, because we also, at the Robertson House, have a great relationship with the daughter, Aisha Shaheeda Simmons, and the work that she's been doing. And there's a black queer feminist woman leading conversations that are looking at intra-community conflict within the black community, looking at ways to overcome and lead sort of transformative justice to, challenge sexual assault and sexual abuse within the black community. So I'm thinking of like the two legacies coming together that really influence this next generation of organizing.
In fact, they mentioned Aisha. I mean, Aisha's the work that she's done on child sexual assault, and also two on the issue of rape and date rape. When I say rape, that which she has had to put up with an enormous amount of verbal abuse because she's been accused of attacking the black community, and that we try to cover these things up and act like they don't exist, and that has been the reality of African American women social changes, is that they have to consistently fight within the community as well as external to the community.
Yeah. Shout out Aisha. I see you. Your message. And I think is there another one?
I'll do it real quick because it was a little glitch, and so we didn't see a couple of the questions. So
okay.
Just one quick thing. Was it the Black Church? Was that the newspaper at Temple that you were thinking about?
Right. Somebody knew that? Oh. Yeah, thank you, Linda. Yeah. The Black Torch was the Temple University newspaper, and our theoretical journal, as we called it, was Maji Maji.
Okay.
Theoretical journals?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I was doing nothing in college.
Yeah, you know, and again, you know, but I think about, you know, when you're doing it, you know, you do what you do.
Yes.
But when I look back on it now, and, you know, when I look at what that 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old young people fundamentally changed the most powerful country in the world.
Yes.
I mean, without any guns. You know, we wasn't even shooting anybody.
Well, folks had them.
You know, but I'm just saying, in the context of a war.
Yes.
You know,
right.
That you know, I tend to think about the civil rights movement as organized state violence against that, if not an unarmed population, at least a nonviolent one. I mean, it was just, it's really amazing in retrospect, and I'm not sure. You know, we just can't talk about it. We have to really get into it, because just one point that thoroughly upsets me is this notion of Martin Luther King's speech, the March on Washington. It's called "I Have a Dream," but I always tell people, read the entire speech, because as far as I'm concerned, the dream part, while nice thoughts, is politically one of the weakest parts of the speech. When you read that speech, it is a very sharp critique of American racism, both then and now, and that we need to determine the narrative of our history, so that it's not just because it's, you know, the ex-mayor of Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo, before he died, says it was saying positive things about Malcolm X. When we all know that he, you know, the contempt that he had for Malcolm X, and people like Malcolm X. So that's what I'm saying. We have to really be in charge of that narrative.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a couple questions together since we're getting short on time and because it was a miss. But one was a question about just asking to hear a little bit more about the SNCC movement in Albany, Georgia, and then also about. In reflecting on your statement on education being a function of opportunity, talk about and then also talk about the interaction of the SNCC tendency versus SCLC tendency in that movement. And then one very quick factual question about the play that you mentioned that was cooperative written. Was that ever performed again?
So we'll just respond to these and close it after this.
Yeah. Okay, let me try to do with the last
one.
Whatever stands up to you.
Yeah. The play was performed twice. Once in the jail, and another time out of the jail at Bucknell. The tragedy, from my point of view, of it is that it was taped by the local Lehigh Valley public broadcasting station, but it was taped on what was that? The Beta or something? Betamax, and somebody destroyed the tape. I mean, what I would give to see that today was, you know, it's priceless. So that's one thing. It was start from the last one.
So the question was about SNCC versus LCAC,
right.
And then anything you might want to ask about SNCC in Albany, Georgia.
Yeah. In terms of SNCC and SCLC, simplistically, the fundamental difference was that, and things are not as neat as I'm going to make it sound, but that SCLC depended on mobilizations, and they had the mobilizer in Martin Luther King, so it's understandable. But we in SNCC, stressed organizing. Now, this is not to say that SCLC didn't organize also, but the amount of energy that we felt that a demonstration of a few hundred people could be as powerful as a demonstration of a few thousand people, depending on what your goals are and were. So that and we tended to minimize our leadership in terms, so that when people think of SNCC today, they know more names today than they did during the contemporary period of SNCC, because it wasn't until Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and A-Trap Brown, Jamil Alameen, that people even knew SNCC names outside the South. The other, Albany. was the first organizing effort that got some national attention that SNCC was engaged in. That it wasn't a mobilization, but it was a very tedious, continual struggle of the people in Albany to integrate the facilities. By the way, when I say that in the short run it failed, I might add. In fact, Martin Luther King came to town and was outsmarted by the local sheriff, which is a whole nother story. But it galvanized the community of Albany, and by extension the community of African Americans in the South, to see what was possible. So that there are people who were part of the Albany movement in the 60s who moved there and stayed there. And that Albany, Georgia had some of them, the SNCC Freedom Singers came out of Albany, Georgia. Some of the best SNCC organizers came out of Albany, Georgia. So that Albany, Georgia was almost a citadel of political protest. And it's just, it continues to frustrate me that it just gets ignored.
Yeah.
And again, I want to add that at least 3 people from Philadelphia played a significant role in that struggle. Yes.
Yeah. I'll say that it may be forgotten in the mainstream now, but luckily there's this SNCC 60th anniversary conference that's coming up October 14th through the 16th, where we can recover many of those stories and many of those contributions. And it's happening online. There is registration available, SNCC60thanniversary.org. Before we close, I also want to give in terms of these reconvenings of SNCC, and what do you feel like is the importance for why people should need to revisit this history and engage with these moments?
Well, I just think that I think back on my youth, and the importance that a person like Bill Crawford had for me to not only to read about history, but to talk to people who experienced it. And that's what I think is so important about the interaction with young people. That again, I want to underscore again that the young people should appreciate what we've done, but there's a lot of stuff that we didn't even know we needed to be done.
Yes.
So I just think that as long as we're still alive, that people should draw on our experiences but also need to forge a way that we may be helpful in their experiences. So it's a yin and yang,
right?
Kind of.
Angela Davis at this Steve Biko lecture in South Africa, it was maybe 2017, 2018. She had this phrase where she said, because they were right in the midst of the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, with a lot of student organizing, the challenging the universities there, and speaking about recovering this connection. And she said, there will always be unfinished activisms. We stand on the shoulders of those before us, but those who stand on our shoulders can see spaces that we might not, be able to have seen.
And one other point, to just again to concretize that, one of the things about SNCC is, right or wrong, whatever we did was not influenced by anything other than we thought it was right. So we didn't care what the mayor thought, what some icon from the past thought. We didn't give a damn. If we thought it was right, we did it. And to me, that's the kind of attitude you have to have in struggle. Now, as you get older, so you get married, you have kids, you got this, that, or the other, then you're factoring a lot of things when you're engaged in social change.
Right.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong if somebody's worried about, oh damn, if I do this, I'm gonna be able to pay my mortgage. But my point is that you can't lead anymore because you got other things that you're thinking about, which is not to minimize it. I'm saying, but you can't be the leader no more. Because I shouldn't have to worry about whether you pay your mortgage when I'm dealing with struggle in the street here.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason why I think one of the powers of the youth is, that like when you're young, you can do it, man. And then that these days you don't even have to pay the price that some people had to pay in terms of opportunities, which, that we still have to struggle. But so that, I'm a firm believer that a politically conscious movement needs older folks, but also young people, and particularly in the leadership.
Yes. I want to thank you so much for taking, time to return to the Robeson House and have this conversation. We're having an intergenerational exchange now and kind of continuing to see how our struggles are renewed. And I also want to give a shout out to Making Worlds Books and Social Center, which is located not too far from Robertson House at 45th and Locust. They were a promotional partner for today's event. They actually, on their online store, they brought together a collection of SNCC related texts, which are available for purchase. So definitely, if you have a chance, stop by Making World Books and get a hold of a text and get ready for the SNCC 60th anniversary conference. So I just want to say thank you so much. This has been an amazing afternoon.
Thank you.
We learned so much. I'm still thinking about the music, and as we close this down, we could turn on some music in here today. And and thank you everyone out there for joining us. This has been another edition of Parlor Talks at the Paul Robeson House. This video will be on our YouTube. We'll have it archived there to watch and return to. Please send and share the link. The link is up there now. Thank you, Linda Carranza, for helping me and volunteer here and helping us with the chat. Thanks, Dr. Anya Love, for being here today, coming off an amazing Coltrane Symposium here in the city. Really excited to engage, and we know did you bring the? Yeah, so we got something nice to show too. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon and evening, and learn more about the Paul Robeson House at paulrobesonhouse.org. Thank you.
Thank you.